Good evening. My name is Mike McGrath, and I'm president of Preservation Delaware. And I want to welcome you to our PDI webinar tonight. Tonight's subject is one that previous participants have frequently asked about, and we're glad to be bringing it to you right now. What is PDI all about? Well, we bring you educational webinars like this one. We join with communities across Delaware to stand up for what's being torn down. And we're working with elected leaders to support historic preservation. Now, to keep webinars like tonight's free to the public, we need your support. Check out our links in the chat. Now, you might want to go to our website to check out upcoming events, like our annual meeting and conferences that will be taking place in October from the 21st through the 23rd. That's a Thursday through Saturday. Our PDI business meeting, which you're welcome to attend, is on Saturday, the 23rd of October. And there'll be interesting conferences online going up to that date. Now let me take a minute and introduce tonight's moderator, Michael Emmons. Michael is the Assistant Director of the University of Delaware Center for Historic Architecture and Design. He is a longtime board member of Preservation Delaware. He holds a bachelor and master's degree in American history, a master's degree in historic preservation, and is currently a doctoral candidate at the University of Delaware. His dissertation, and I find this really interesting, is examining historical graffiti, inscriptions, and other markings in old buildings. Michael, take it away.
Okay, thank you, Mike, for that introduction, and looking forward to this program tonight. I'm excited to introduce our speakers shortly, but we wanted to open tonight with a quick several polls, a quick series of polls to gauge audience knowledge, which we thought would be kind of fun. So I'm going to go ahead and share the first of those here now, which is knowledge level. So what is your knowledge level regarding Delaware's architectural history? And you can see the first choice is you're clueless. What is architecture? I love old buildings, but don't really know how to describe them. The third option is I know some styles and terminology, but not a lot. Fourth, I recognize most major styles, but don't have deep history or the terminology. And then lastly, I have a thorough knowledge, or I'm even a professional architectural historian, which I assume we do have a few of those in tonight. So I'll give everyone a few minutes here, or a few seconds, I should say, to select that their best choice. You can only choose one. These are, by the way, anonymous. All the questions are anonymous, so you don't have to worry about anyone seeing your answer. Looks like we still have some answers coming in, so we'll give it a few more seconds. Okay, looks like they're all in, so I'll go ahead and end the poll. Can everyone see the question box? I see there's one comment that people aren't getting the poll. We did have, it looks like probably 60 responses. So I think most people probably could. So hopefully you can see the poll now. I have shared the results. And we have 39% that say they know some styles, some terminology, but not a lot. The next most popular answer was that they recognize most major styles, but they don't have deep history or terminology. And then tied for third was people who love old buildings, but just don't know much about how to describe them, or even 9 people, another 15% that are either have thorough knowledge or are actual professional architectural historians. We did have one person that said, I'm clueless, what is architecture? So yeah, sorry if anyone had issues on that. We'll see how the next one goes. So the second one is about specific architectural styles. So I'm going to go ahead and launch that now. Hopefully you guys can see that or see it shortly. So which of the following architectural styles would you definitely recognize when you saw it? So you're driving down the street somewhere in Delaware and you see a neat old house, old building, and you can choose multiple answers here. So any you think for sure you would recognize. None, Georgian, Federal or the Adams style, Greek Revival, Gothic Revival, Italianate, Second Empire. You may be able to see a couple more styles. If you scroll down, there's Queen Anne Victorians, Romanesque, and Craftsman. And we stop with that because tonight's talk will mostly focus on pre-20th century architecture. A lot of answers are still rolling in. Just give it a couple more seconds. All right, I'm going to go ahead and end this and share the results. So as you can see, we had a few people that said they didn't know any of the styles below. The clear winners were Georgian and Federal at 71% each. People feel like they recognize those early styles of architecture, but then when it goes up, still a lot of recognition, but there's definitely some categories, especially getting to later 19th century, I think, where people aren't sure what those look like. Okay, so the third and final question before we launch into the program is terminology. So I'm going to launch that poll now. Hopefully everyone can see this now. So the question here is, which architectural elements could you point out on a building? So if you pulled up in front of a building in your car and were asked to point these terms out, could you point them out on a building? So one answer is none of the below. The first answer is door. Then we have fanlight, lintel, pilaster, belt course, finial, lancet window, coining, and lastly entablature. Lots of answers rolling in. I see there's a few people saying they can't see the poll, and I'm not sure how to rectify that. If anyone else on the Zoom has any ideas, let me know.
The poll is a pop-up, so if you've got pop-up blocking, that may prevent you from seeing it.
Yeah, because we've got at least 70 responses on this question, so I think the majority of the participants are able, but I have a feeling that's what's going on. Okay, it looks like the questions or the responses are slowing down, so I'm going to go ahead and a couple more just popped in. So I'm going to end this poll and share the results. So luckily 97% of respondents recognize a door. And then we have quite a few other ones. Fanlight, finial, got pretty high marks. We also have pilaster, which I'm actually surprised, 60% no pilaster, which I don't think I knew until I came to graduate school and started studying this. But there are some mystery ones. The lancet window and tablature got lower scores. So that's interesting. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing that and close this out. So thank you everyone for participating. That's helpful, and I think it will help David understand what people know and don't know about architecture. It gives us a little bit of information. So just a couple of quick housekeeping things before I introduce the speaker and we start the program. So during the program, feel free, if you look in your Zoom in the bottom right, especially if you're using a browser, I don't know if it's different on a phone, there is a function called Q&A where you can submit questions. So anytime during the program, feel free to submit a question for our speaker. And at the end of the program, we will get to as many of those questions as we can. So that is through the Q&A function, not the chat function. However, with the chat function, I want to encourage people to share general observations. And we thought it might be fun if people wanted to share a building in particular they think is a really cool historic building or a beautiful historic building here in Delaware. You could even share a link, I think, to a Wikipedia about a favorite building or some other photograph. So please feel free to use those at the bottom, both the chat function to share a building or general discussion, or submit a question using the Q&A button at the bottom. And so with that housekeeping over, I'm going to go ahead and introduce our speaker tonight. It's my distinct pleasure tonight to introduce Dr. David Ames, who I've personally known for about a decade. And I imagine many on this call probably have known David for even much longer. Professor Ames is the former director and co-founder of the center that I now help run at the University of Delaware, the Center for Historic Architecture and Design, or CHAD. David is now a professor emeritus of public policy, administration, and geography, as well as material culture studies at UD, where he researched and taught from 1979 to 2016. Before that, he was associate professor of urban studies and planning at Virginia Commonwealth University from 1971 to 1979. David was co-director of the master's program in historic preservation at UD from 2011 to 2014, and he was the director of CHAD from 1984 to 2014. He was also dean of UD's College of Urban Affairs and Public Policy, which is now called the Biden School, from 1979 to 1991. And though he's been gone from CHAD for about 5 years, I think we're still finding circular coffee stains from David's coffee mugs all around the office. Professor Ames always taught his students, including me, to look more closely at buildings. So tonight's presentation, I think, is an extension of that lifetime of work. But besides educating many of the Mid-Atlantic's preservationists, planners, and architectural historians, one of David's largest legacies to Delaware's preservation might be his nearly 40 years of photography of its buildings and landscapes throughout Delaware. Much of Dr. Ames's photographic collection, including negatives, prints, and slides, is currently being digitized by the Center for Historic Architecture and Design. So we're excited that's going to be available to the public through two different databases very soon. I was happy to be in Washington, D.C. several years ago, the night David was honored with the James Marston Fitch Preservation Education Lifetime Achievement Award, which was a high honor that he received from the National Council of Preservation Education. So with that, I'd like you all to please join me in welcoming my former professor and former colleague, Dr. David Ames. And with that, David, feel free to share your screen and bump our PowerPoint with your PowerPoint.
All right, thank you. Okay. Well, thank you for that kind introduction. I am really pleased to be here. I would like to thank you for inviting me. The opportunities to talk about Delaware architecture are somewhat rare, and I'm really impressed with the audience's knowledge of a Delaware architecture from the polls, so I need to be careful, I guess. However, I must forewarn you that I am not sure agreeing to give this presentation was the wisest decision I ever made. As Michael mentioned, I retired from UD 5 years ago, moved to Louisville, and hadn't thought much about Delaware architecture since. So maybe the subtitle of this talk should be, quote, as remembered 5 years later. As well, I have only the photographs that I had when I left. So the rest of the subtitle might be, and he has photographs for him. However, once into it, it has been a very enjoyable preparation. Although a bit more time consuming than expected, is like everything we do, it's been like a reunion, getting acquainted with favorite buildings and old architectural friends, with stabs of grief when learning when a favorite one is gone, as in the case of the magnificent Italianate hedge lawn burned down to give the fire department practice to make way for a motorcycle dealership. Oops, slides aren't moving. Michael, help.
I'm not sure. So if you click on the PowerPoint and hit your side arrows on the.
Oh, there we go.
key.
Okay, there we go. Got it. Thank you. Before getting to architecture, I'd like to refresh your memory about Delaware itself. I believe its physiography, climate, and cultural landscape are important contexts for understanding the evolution of its historic architecture. It may surprise you to learn that For its size, Delaware is physically and culturally one of the most complex states. Yes, little old Delaware. Topping only Rhode Island, Delaware is the second smallest state in the US, covering about 2,000 square miles. Of its 3 counties from north to south, Newcastle contains 13% of the territory, Kent County 30%, leaving nearly half of the state to Sussex County. Wilmington is but 0.6%. No, excuse me. Look at in its physical geography, Delaware is part of 2 major East Coast physiographic regions, the hilly Piedmont in the north and the Atlantic coastal plain covering most of the south. Swift streams in the hilly Piedmont in northern Delaware provided water power for the earliest industrial development in the country and the DuPont Company's powder mills. That same division actually is also mirrored in climate, because the line between the northern temperate climate and the southern subtropical climate really runs along northern Delaware. And as a matter of fact, I believe that northern Delaware has the richest mix of plant seeds of any place in the United States. And the snow line, which used to move, run along Kirkwood Highway, it may have moved north with global warming. Culturally, however, Delaware was and is one of the most complex areas in the United States. North of the C&D Canal, the state is part of the Mid-Atlantic region centered on Philadelphia. One historian dubbed the people of northern Delaware as Philadelphians. South of the C&D Canal, the state behaves economically and culturally like a southern state. The southwestern part of Sussex, actually once part of Maryland, lies in the Chesapeake Bay drainage basin and is part of the Eastern Shore culturally with its own architectural traditions. So the joke about Upper and Delaware isn't really a joke at all. It's the reality of the state's cultural landscape. In terms of population, from 1790 to 1980, Delaware grew from 60,000 to about 600,000, passing the 500,000 mark in the 1970s. After that, fueled mostly by rapid suburbanization in the north and coastal coast in the south, the state reached an almost 1 million by 2020. But so why is looking at population growth important? Because buildings are built to house new population, and thus population growth drives architectural evolution. For purposes of understanding of all the architectural styles, we need to look closely at the 19th century. This graph, where's my pointer? My pointer disappears. Okay. This graph dramatically shows Delaware's pattern of population growth. 2 things are striking. The first is the rapid growth after 1840. You can see it just climbing up there, which was accounted for primarily by Wilmington, which also accounts for the rapid growth of Newcastle County right below it. The second feature are the 2 flat lines across the bottom, which are represented by Kent and Sussex. And the red line that I drew in there represents rural Newcastle County. The slow growth and even stability created a situation with low demand for new buildings and an emphasis on maintaining existing buildings. Delaware grew at an average of 6.7% per decade in the 19th century compared to the national rate per county of 34%. The effect on the architectural landscape was also influenced by Delaware being a relatively poor state, which could not afford grand and stylish architecture. Many who wished to remain fashionable added decorative elements of new styles to their houses. For example, many added mansard roofs to modernize an older Georgian or federal building. Much of the addition of new styles was invisible because it consisted of interior decorations such as new fireplaces. Most importantly, architecturally conservative Delawareans continued to build new classical boxes or Georgian and federal type buildings decorated in the new styles until the 1870s. As the authors of Building of Delaware, Barksdale Maynard put it, signature styles of the early 19th century are relatively rare, except in a conservative manifestations by which Greek forms and motifs were grafted on old-fashioned Georgian boxes. Only the later 19th century did Delawareans begin to build in more asymmetrical forms, due in part perhaps to the advent of wooden stick construction, which made such forms easier and cheaper to build. So what does the subtitle more than meets the eye mean? It means being able to recognize these subtleties and diversity in Delaware architecture. However, before going on, it is important to recognize that Delaware does have some nationally and internationally significant historic properties and landscapes, which we shouldn't overlook. These include 14 National Historic Landmarks, 2 of which we feature here tonight. Perhaps next famous are those associated with the DuPonts, starting with the DuPont powder mills at Hagley and much of northern Delaware, known as Chateau Country, of which our moderator, Michael, is an expert. In addition, with a coastline along the ocean, Atlantic Ocean and Delaware Bay, the state has outstanding maritime resources, such as the coastal fortifications from the Revolutionary War to World War II. Let's move on to historic architecture. Most of you already have an idea about what historic Delaware architecture is, as witnessed by the poll, my goodness. Speaking to an audience of experts. So let's start by what I think it means in this talk. We'll start with historic, move to architecture and on to Delaware. Architectural fashion follows population growth and new buildings needed to house it, as I've said before. So for example, the nation's best Greek Revival architecture is to be found along the Erie Canal in New York, which was built in the 1820s when Greek Revival style was popular. Let's start with historic. I want each of you to pick a date before which you consider things to be historic. No hints. I shouldn't have shown the slide before I asked you the question, right? Although we are going to be looking at architecture from the 1730s to 1908, in the United States, we have something called the National Register of Historic Places. To be considered for the National Register, a property must meet 2 markers. It must be historic and it must retain integrity. What is historic? Are you ready? To be, as I've given it away already, to be historic, a property must be more than 50 years old. So that, so one was 50 years, it was just 70 years ago. And now many of you can realize that you too are eligible for the National Register of Historic Places. The second prerequisite to be listed on the National Register is that the property must have physical integrity. That means the building should look like it did when it was built for its period of significance. So my goal tonight is to teach you how to look at Delaware architecture and interpret its integrity by learning some basic styles, which you already know, and they're now in their Delaware variations, their physical features and how to recognize them. And that's my goal. First, let's start with the definition of historic architecture. I'm defining it here as the features that make a building notable and historically identifiable. It includes form, decorative motif, method of construction, building materials, and regional character, and change over time, reflecting new fashions, new ideas, and technology or materials. Although historically, some have considered historic architecture to be that designed by architects reflecting formal styles, aspects of a style, that definition has broadened in recent years to include nearly all buildings. It reflects the growth of a field called vernacular architecture consisting of everyday buildings. In this presentation, we consider all buildings as historic architecture, and you may encounter some buildings you wouldn't have previously considered historic. So let's go on to take a look at architectural styles. The book, A Field Guide to American Houses by McAlester, which many of you probably already own, is the Bible reference to American residential architecture. I show you the Amazon ad for used ones because a new one on hardback costs about 45 bucks. You can go out and even buy 2 or 3 for less than $20. One for the home, one for your car. Styles evolve over time. In the 19th century, architectural styles went through 2 broad stages. First half of the century was marked by classical styles, and the second half by Romantic styles. Classical styles were derived from Greek and Roman sources, and Romantic styles by earlier medieval architecture. The Greek temple was a model for the classical style, and the medieval cathedral with soaring towers, that for the Romantic style. Physically, the styles were opposites, with the classical marked by symmetry and the Romantic by asymmetry, as we've seen here. Building on the right is the only Louisville building in the presentation. We got this great Romanesque. But you can see the stark contrast in the Reed House to this Richardsonian Romanesque house. Now, here is a combination of our agenda for tonight and the sequence of styles. Similarly, the introduction of Romantic architecture was, oh, wait a minute, excuse me. Classical styles were introduced from England at the beginning of the 18th century. And the first stage was called Georgian. Later in the century, in the 1780s, reflecting both the influence of English architect Robert Adams and an attempt to reflect a national American identity, the style was modified and called Federal. It was, in fact, the architectural reflection of the larger revolution. Similarly, the introduction of the Romantic architecture was part of the larger Romantic movement of the 19th century. Romantic architectural styles first appeared as Gothic Revival and Italianate in the 1840s, blossomed in the 1860s and 1870s in a series of distinctive styles which merged, becoming more eclectic. The Second Empire style of the 1870s, with its distinctive mansard roof, was an explicit style, with the later towered Queen Anne style in the 1880s becoming more of an eclectic Victorian form. The century ended with the monumental stone castle-like style known as Richardsonian Romanesque. Now, what I'd like to talk about for a minute is how to approach buildings when you're in the field. And what I want you to do is to think about yourself as being a zoom lens. Look at the building overall, step back from it, go over it, look at its setting, its overall shape, its roof and roof features, projections, and so on. And then, like a zoom lens, move in. And one exercise I have students do is to stand back from the building, like a couple of 100 feet, look at it, and then walk toward it. And as they walk toward it, see what comes into focus that they didn't see before, until they end up with their nose in the bricks or the wood, seeing what the basic course is, like this. So there you go. And right, once you get your nose up to it, that's what you begin to see. So let's start with our elements. Let's start with the style elements of the classical Georgian architecture. First of all, classical architecture tends to be horizontal in the portion of the Golden Triangle. And that horizontality is emphasized by a number of features. First of all, you have the foundation line, which is called the water table. You have the belt course, which is those projecting bricks between the first and second windows. You have the cornice above there with those, and you have the roof. Now the roof, for the perspective of this photograph, make this roof seem much smaller. The center of decoration in the Georgian house is the front door. The other aspect is symmetry. You've got what we call bilateral symmetry with an even number of windows flanking the central axis. And that in turn is reflected in the floor plan. And the decorative theme and as this building form, Delawareans would respond to architectural style by decorating these boxes in different styles. Now, here is a Corbett Sharp house in Odessa. And this is acknowledged as one of the great late Georgian houses in the United States. And you can see the things we just talked about in terms of this horizontal shape, the divisions, the horizontal divisions, the water table at the bottom, the belt course, and the cornice. Another indicator are windows. You'll notice that these have 12/12 windows with small panes. That was because most glass at that time was imported, and over time, as glass technology increases, window size increased, and we'll see window sizes go from 12/12 to 4/4, and finally in the Victorian 1/1. So looking at windows is also a way of dating a building. Here is the Corbett Sharp house, the Amsel house in Newcastle from 1838, one of the earliest Georgian houses. And it is a gable end house. And it has the elements we just talked about in terms of the symmetry, in terms of the shape. And you'll notice that it's heavier in its decoration than is the Corbett Sharp house. And the door being a decorative centerpiece, 9/9 windows, and getting a close-up of this drop-dead door head. And then we move back to the Corbett Sharp house, and you can see the same kind of details there. Moving to southern Delaware, in Sussex County, we find a simpler form in Cannon Hall in 1820 near Woodland Ferry in wood. And then Old Doris Church, 1773, which is thought to be one of the finest Georgian chapels in the United States. Again, it has the early features in terms of the numbers of panes of windows. And again, you can see the horizontal divisions. And we move down then in smaller size to 3-bay. You should get a quick reaction now about how old this one is. You get a sense that it's an older building, 1730s. And it also has a pent roof, which was also an early feature. And we can move to Market Street and find this little guy on Market Street, 2.5 stories, and represented the commercial. They didn't have specialized commercial buildings until the 1880s, and so most commercial buildings were carried out. Commerce was carried out in the first floor of residential houses, and then. Also, large public buildings were simply larger versions of small. So here we have the state capitol, which is basically a 5-bay house on steroids, with representing the late Georgian period. So as we move through the Adam to Federal period from 1780 to 1820, look at this house and see what you see that has changed. This is the Reed House. This is a National Historic Landmark. And you see it has become simpler. The horizontal divisions are missing. The windows are larger. And the signature feature of the Federal style is that fan-like window above the door. And to a lesser extent, the plate-in window above. When I say Palladian window refers to that three-part window with centered on a round-headed window with two flanking vertical windows. These are the origins of the Reed House, the Brigham Mansion in Philadelphia in 1788, and a detail of the original drawings for the Reed House, which shows the central bay, which also illustrates that houses don't usually turn out exactly like their drawings. And here's just to look a little bit more at the Reed House in terms of seeing the size of it from the back, and again the fanlight. Again, the windows themselves in this plain facade become a major design element in the building. Also incorporated in these buildings were gardens, almost Japanese-like, with the backyard of the Reed House and the side yard through a window. Thought you might like to see the interior. Again, has this simpler, plainer form, but again, the signature feature of the arches. This is the front parlor, the formal parlor in the front, the garden parlor in the back. You'll also notice in the back, the windows go to the floor, so they open up for windows into the garden. On the right, on the left, on the right is a central hall looking from front to rear. And you'll notice that the arches get progressively smaller toward the door. Details, this wonderful fireplace, and then the servant's bell on the front parlor. So we see these general federal style houses in Delaware and Odessa, Newcastle. You might begin to look at the one on the left and think, well, maybe it's a little transitional, given the windows and the small narrow door. But the one on the right in Newcastle is late federal building, becoming almost totally plain in terms of its surfaces. And you'll notice it has 6/6 windows and a large fan line. Different types of houses, row house, cloud, I think it's the cloud house. You can see the divisions that continue there. That still has some Georgian aspect to it, and this vernacular duplex in Delaware City. And examples of different materials. Here we have plank, and again in Newcastle, but looking closely at this, you might interpret something about it. You notice that it's not exactly symmetrical. It right side is different than the left, so it might have been built originally as a 3-bay building. Some people in the audience may know this, and then the right side added later. So here we have a contrast, and I say federal to Georgian, and the way it's laid out, it's really Georgian to federal. So you can look at these two buildings and see what they have in common as classical buildings in terms of their rectangular outline, horizontal orientation, and detailing. You can see the changes in the size of windows and the front and the shift to the fanlight as a signature feature. Greek Revival style. The signature feature of Greek Revival style historically has been what we call the temple front. This is on the UD campus. It's not really an historic building. It was done in the 1930s, but it's a great picture of a temple front. And over here, you can see the types of temple fronts that evolved. Now, Delaware did not embrace temple fronts. Here we have two examples, one in Sussex County, which I believe is a small doctor's office, and it has all the elements. To me, that's kind of a wonderful metaphor for Delaware, this sort of miniaturized little temple. On the right, we have one of the most famous temple fronts, Old College at UD. But this is an example of how buildings evolve. This temple front is not from the 18th century. It's actually in this form from 1916. Old College was first built in, oh, here my thing, back. In back, this was kind of a federal type building. The temple front, modest ones were added first in 1850s, and then columns added in 1890s. And then this elaborate temple front was added in 1916 when the whole campus was redesigned and rebuilt. One thing I would like to point out, a feature of a temple front that we will see later, is this frieze band window. I'm sorry, it's called a frieze band, and we'll see that showing up in abstracted features when we look at more vernacular buildings. Now, here is a Delaware version of Greek Revival. As I said, it's the classical 5-bay building with Greek Revival features added. This Greek Revival porch, and look at, for example, the detail of the slope of the window of the roof on the dormers. They're very shallow, and the slope of the roof is shallow, but it's still the basic 5-bay classic house. Now, we also have Greek temples in Delaware, except they're churches. And it was a good form for churches because it was accommodated audiences and processions. But this is at 1845. And you can see these features, which was in your quiz, is a pilaster. A pilaster is a flat column. And you can see the proportion and the slope and the roofs, shallow roof on both of these. I think this is red clay, and this addition was a wonderful addition done right before I left, actually, and it's handicapped access. It's an elevator so people can get in, but it's done. I think it's done beautifully compatibly with the building. Now, so how did Delawareans Greekify their classical forms? Here we see an example of a pointer is kind of unpredictable. On the left, a point of what's called a sort of a New England house, but it's been modified. It has pilasters on the corner. And as you can see, the pediment on the top. And if we look on the right hand, we see a Delaware version, which is obviously long since gone. But in this modest wooden farmhouse, we can see the Greek features and the pilasters in the corner. It has a very modest Greek door. It's got the shallow sloping roof, and the window frames, when you get up close, have Greek detailing. At upper level, then, Delawareans modified Greek with again, there are classical houses with Greek details in terms of Buena Vista on the right, which is 1845, and this house in Odessa, the name of which I can't remember, which again is a 5-bay with a Greek Revival porch and details like the dormer roofs. Then we have what we might call big box, what I've called big box Greek Revival, and these are in Delaware City. Again, now let's return to the frieze. One of the identifying element for Greek Revival are what we call frieze band windows. This narrow, these narrow windows across the top, and consider those kind of an abstraction of the frieze band in a temple front. And in here it's continued. You got the frieze band windows, and then you have the columns represented in the pilasters on the corner. And again, this has a very Greek Revival porch. This does the one on the left. And we have big box Greek Revival. Now, Hedgelawn tragically was burned down as a training exercise by the fire department to make way for a motorcycle dealership. I got a picture of the fire, but I didn't get a chance to put it in. I didn't want to. It was very painful to look at. In Delaware City, here's another example of a big box Greek Revival. And again, you can see the features, the Greek Revival porch with the pilaster, and in this case, a flat roof, and the more vertical Greek Revival windows. We can come down a notch in terms of size to 3-bay. And again, seeing the frieze band windows as the tip-off, the porches, not so much on this one, but again, then the shallow sloped roofs. And down another notch to very small row houses. So these design elements of Greek Revival carry through all different kinds of forms. So while Delaware has very few of any temple fronts, very few temple fronts. It has a lot of Greek Revival stuff. And we move on to Gothic Revival, and the Gothic Revival cross gable cottage we see on the left here in Middletown, many of you have probably driven by that many times, is probably the most common form of Gothic Revival in the state. And we can see down here, we have single gable, we have double gable, and we'll see in a moment in Delaware, we have triple gables. And usually the smaller 3-bay. The more traditional Gothic Revival is this church in 1840 in Newark. But this building, which wonderfully shows the verticality of the Gothic Revival, called the pointed style, and it was so pointed, it took me off of the photograph. I couldn't get the points on the top. But look at how many vertical elements are in there and reinforcing in terms of the gable ends and the finials on top of those mini dormers and the whole shape of the building. So it's the Greek Gothic Revival was said to have been reaching for the sky, and this building certainly is reaching for the sky. And it was a church style, very popular for churches. In the 1840s, there was a lot of debate among churches about what was the appropriate style for a particular church. Catholic and Episcopalians tended to go for Gothic. Others tended to go for other styles, partly based on cost. But this little vernacular Gothic really exemplifies the kind of vertical aspect with this pointed recessed windows that just exaggerate the point. Many of you have probably seen this in outside in Sussex County, the gatehouse. This little gatehouse kind of exemplifies all of the Gothic Revival cottage. It's got other verticality we haven't talked about in terms of batten board and so on. And it also is behind, which we'll see in a moment, one of the great Italianate villas in the state. We haven't gotten there yet. And we see it elsewhere, such as the railroad station, former railroad station in Newark, now the Newark History Center. And in more traditional church forms, such as St. Louis Episcopal Church in North Street. Now, I don't know how many of you have seen Parson Thorn. It's a little off the road, but it's this great example of the Delaware adaptation of adding styles to older buildings as they evolve. So that the Georgian core of this building, as you see at the bottom, was built in 1730 and 1735. The small building in the back, which is an L, is actually older. In 1879, they upgraded it, made it more fashionable by adding this Gothic Revival cross gable roof. And you can actually see the shadows of the old roof in the brick on the end. The tree wasn't there. So cross gable Gothic Revival cottages went from singles, like this humble one on the left, to triples, like this one on Dover Green, which many of you have seen. And again, it has other verticality we haven't seen, like the vertical boards and so on, and this really great Gothic Revival porch with the pointed arches and so on, lancet arches. And oh, there's a lancet window. That was on your quiz. There are 2 lancet windows. Those pointed windows are called lancet windows. However, ironically, Delaware's most famous Gothic Revival cottage has no cross gable, like this little beauty Rose Cottage in Dover. It's 1855. And this to me was kind of the best example of a Gothic cottage. I came across it in an older slideshow I'd done. I don't know where it is actually, and I think it's a digital made from a slide. But it has all of the elements, including the kind of later barge decoration along the window, along the roof, the fully developed lancet window, a porch which has since been filled in. And what's also nice about it, it shows the evolution of buildings, because in the back you have this later addition, which is Second Empire, and probably this bay window was added during the Second Empire change. Now, even though we talk about vernacular Gothic Revival cottages, Delaware has these wonderfully detailed, small, humble wooden cottages, such as this one in Sussex County. So I'll call vernacular, there's nothing simple about it. Also, Gothic Revival cottages are found in cities. This is on Quaker Hill on the left with the double lancet window and the kind of double windows characteristic of Gothic Revival. With the, it's a cast iron porch. You may not be able to tell it. It was probably added later. And then another more humble one in Delaware City with a Carpenter Gothic porch. I think, however, those balusters, I think, probably are not historically accurate and probably come from Home Depot. They look like interior narrow balusters and not exterior thick ones. And then we move to the double cross gable Gothic Revival, which we see a lot of in Sussex County. And these are just wonderfully elegant little buildings. And finally, to the triple cross gable cottage in Dover Green. This is one of the best examples, I think, of a Gothic porch that I've seen. We saw it a little bit earlier. But again, it's the Gothic on a 5-bay classical base. And then we have a variation in Carpenter Gothic, which occurred in the 1860s, and 1870s. We moved to Italianate. And Italianate has been called the bracketed style. It was actually called the bracketed style when it was popular. It wasn't called Italianate at the time. And here's an example of Italianate, a square type house, and the brackets are the signature features. So when you see brackets, think big brackets, think Italianate. And here's 2 examples of Italianate in Delaware, both in, these are both in Odessa. This house on the left caught fire and is now I just got a photograph of it this afternoon. I couldn't incorporate it, but it's just in terrible shape now, caught a fire. This is the Odessa Bank, but these really stand out with their signature features. So these are really like brackets on steroids. And we get big box Italianate. We get the Green Mansion in Newark, and this Italianate in Newcastle. And although you don't see brackets at the roof line, you certainly see brackets on the lintels and the doorhead on the building itself. The green, oops. This also represents a polychromatic stone being used for Italianate too, as in the case of this green limestone. And then we move down a notch to more vernacular, simpler Italianate, but still retain the various, the form, the square form and the flat top. And this one on the other one. Now, with situations like this, it's difficult to know whether or not, in terms of repair, brackets are made of wood and tend to rot, and so people tend to remove them. So this may have had brackets. Again, Italianate used as a bank. And here the high end, the Ross, we saw the gatehouse for the Ross Mansion, really a formal country villa, probably straight out of the pattern book of, I think it's about 1879. And the detail. The round windows, round windows are a feature of Italianate. And it, not sure, some have argued that there's a Georgian house hidden in there, and that the Italianate was added in terms of the towers and the wings. Some of you in the audience may know about that. But again, now we move to Second Empire into Mansard. Okay, we've been going 40 minutes, gang, and I've got 45 minutes. So this is set up so I can kind of bail out, but we may run to 50 minutes, warning you, Michael, but I'll get there. So the characteristic of the Second Empire was the mansard roof. And very often it's very difficult to tell whether a building is truly Second Empire, because adding mansard roofs was a very popular way of modernizing somebody's house. The highest end Second Empire we have is the Opera House, 1871 in Wilmington. Here, very interesting. I put this in to tell a little story, and I'll tell the story very quickly. In terms of documentation, we have objective documentation and we have evocative documentation. This is on the left is kind of objective. When I was documenting the interior and walked outside in the evening, and here was the porch, and it was very evocative because I could imagine people sitting there on their porches in the evening, rocking, talking to people going along the outside. Oh, my pointer's back. All right. In Wilmington, we have a smaller version of Second Empire, as we can see here in Quaker Hill, with the really exaggerated mansard roofs and the extensions, which also added to floor space. Here is my favorite Second Empire house, maybe in the state, but certainly in Wilmington, and as a house. I love this. It's in Quaker Hill. It has all of the features. We can find also in Middletown, these, again, 5 bay houses in the Second Empire form. And just throw these in for a couple of examples, take a look at them. One in Dover on State Street, the other one in Georgetown, and we'll move on. For those of you from Newark, you know this one well. And then we move down scale to urban row houses. Believe this on the left is on, I know it's in Wilmington, I think it's on 4th Street. Now, Howard. Okay, guys, we're up to 42 minutes, so here we go. It's kind of like put your seatbelts on, we'll put on the afterburners. But we have these tower types of Second Empires. And in the 1870s and 80s here, we begin to see Delaware develop these asymmetrical buildings. And the one on the left is in Dover Green. I can't remember where the one on the right is, but these begin to see eclecticism set in, that is mixing of styles in various buildings. On to Queen Anne. I call it the towered style. But here in Delaware City, there's a nice non-towered version. Again, it becomes more eclectic, incorporating different styles. I like this purple guy. This is my favorite Queen Anne, though, Queen Anne birdhouse. If you're aware of the Queen Anne birdhouse in Delaware City, it's a little imitation there. Delaware City, I maybe have that tradition too, because I think there's a couple of other houses that have little miniature of the main house as a birdhouse. And then we see some more Second Empire, more Queen Anne. Now there's also a step down. There's something called Princess Anne. The one on the left in Newark is Queen Anne, but the one on the right is more of a Princess Anne, which is a simplified version. And we see it again reflected in Wilmington row houses. Then we come to Richardson Romanesque, late 19th century. The classical house form is seen on the left. It tends to be more, it's kind of like Queen Anne in stone in terms of the house with a corner tower. Here we see this classic furnace building. This was 1908. Those is actually 2 buildings. The one on the left was built in 1888, and the duplicate on the right was built in 1908. And there's an addition from 1921. But it reflects Furness's kind of version of Romanesque with the use of stone and the contrasting textures and colors, contrasting textures in a darker color. And so we'll move on. Here is a simpler version in Dover, which has more Romanesque detailing than heavy stone. This to me, I think, is the best little Romanesque building, Richardson Romanesque building in Wilmington, and if not in parts of the state, because it has all the arch, which is a major Richardsonian feature, and then the arched windows along the side and the heavy stone. We have a Romanesque, modest Romanesque church, and this, I can't remember the name of this train station either. Many of you can, but this is sort of throwing in a shingle style. We don't get much shingle style at all in Delaware. We have the mix we can see with commercial, with this Queen Anne's Tower flanking with the Italianate in downtown Wilmington, and we can see it there in contrast to the newer development. And we finish the Diamond State, Delaware, with this little diamond in this Furness Library in Newcastle. However, what I wanted to mention about that, we're at 46 minutes, guys, so I'm going to take 4 more, is that this was state of the art in terms of library design. It's hexagonal, so what that does is multiply the number of walls for which there are bookshelves. It's also before electric light, and you see that big roof light at the top. The first floor is also floored with translucent block, so the light comes through the roof light down to the floor, and then also lights the basement. And so here we have the Romanesque arch, but we also have buildings talking to each other. Furness is kind of talking to the colonial buildings with the Flemish bond brickwork alternating in this panel, sort of reflects the surrounding Wilmington. And that's it. So we are at 47 minutes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. That was a great overview of all the pre-1900 architectural styles to be found in Delaware. And I think there's a lot of stuff to digest in there, a lot of good stuff. But we have a couple of questions that have rolled in I'd like to throw out there while we still have time. But first, a couple more housekeeping things. If anyone does want to add a question to the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, do click the Q&A and submit a question. If we can get to more questions, we will. And David always likes to ask at the end of his talks, always did this to students and all the talks I saw him give, what is one thing that stuck out to you in this talk that you found surprising, that you didn't know before, something you think you'll carry with you after tonight? Because, you know, we can't retain all of this stuff. So I would use the chat feature to share with David something you found interesting from his talk, and we'll make sure to keep those and share those with him. So please do that in the chat, and please use the Q&A button to actually pose questions for right now. So the first question that came in, David, is how does Delaware's architecture compare with neighboring states?
Oh man, that's a big question. Well, it tends to be less diverse because Delaware was small, and as I was saying, the other states have cities and larger cities and so on, and so they have kind of a much greater variety of styles and more specifically designed in a particular style, rather than Delaware sort of modified their existing stock and then build relatively small scale of the larger styles.
All right, we have another question here. Someone asked, it says, you know, most of these styles seem to be channeling English influence. Was there any Swedish influence on Delaware's architecture from the early Swedish presence?
Yeah, well, the famous cabin. I really don't know. I can't respond to that. I've read about that, but I haven't looked it up. It's kind of faded from me. I'm sorry, I can't answer that well.
Yeah, my impressions are that that has been debated, whether there's certain features that show up in some of Delaware's properties that may show a carryover from Swedish influence in Wilmington and Newcastle. But I think the consensus has come down that as far as any lasting impact, I don't think there was much as far as Swedish influence on Delaware's buildings.
Well, there are earlier examples showing very parapeted buildings in Newcastle and so on, but
There's also debates about corner fireplaces in some buildings and whether that was a kind of a Swedish thing that might have caught on, but most of those were built far after the Swedes were really a strong cultural presence, I think, on the landscape. So I think I've always been a little skeptical of those kind of explanations. We have another question here. Do you have a favorite building in Delaware that jumps to mind? And if so, what is your favorite architectural building in Delaware?
well, I love that little library in Newcastle. The one I ended up with, that's kind of why I ended up with it. I really like that little Gothic Revival house I showed up on Quaker Hill. There are others, but those are two that really strike me. I'm so fascinated by that library because it's so Victorian in the sense that Victorians progressive in terms of interest in mechanical things and progress with historical architecture for them. So this very modern state-of-the-art library is ensconced in this very Romanesque medieval form of architecture. That's interesting.
Someone here wanted to know if you know anything else about the Wilmington train station you showed that was designed by Frank Furness.
No, not right now.
I know there was someone actually studying that in other Frank Furness train stations, though, that we had interaction with it at Chad a few years ago. So there might be something online about that person.
There's a Frank Furness historic district downtown, as you know.
Yeah.
And I'm sure they've got material on it. But no, but there's been, I think, quite a bit of work done on that station because it was rehabbed and it was part of by the railroad administration. So.
Another question here, David. As the various styles that cycled through the communities in Delaware, was it purely driven by fashion, or were there other factors like economics and religion, or anything that led to these different styles?
No, I think it was driven. Well, there's a partiality among various religions for particular styles in terms of the Gothic and the Episcopalians. But no, I think it was primarily by fashion. And in fact, fashion wasn't really a big thing because, you know, what I've shown you, although I've shown you the styles, they're relatively modest addition to the buildings, you know, sticking with the basic classical form and then embellishing them with the style of the type of the kind. So I don't think so.
Yeah, and I would also point out that technology also drove fashion to some degree as people, as parts began to be mass produced in the Romantic era and Victorian eras, and also disseminated all over the country with trains and that kind of thing. It became cheaper to buy more intricate parts, and I think that drove a lot of the Victorianization and alterations. So
let me go back to an earlier point and reinforce it, and that is the role of population stability. You know, this place did not grow. You know, Kent County stayed the same population for 30 years. So did southern Newcastle County. Also, Kent County in the 1890s and so on was a place to get away from because it was humid and it was a bad climate. It was malarial. And then Sussex County, of course, eastern Sussex was full of marshes and so on. And the inside was kind of an impenetrable forest. So in that broader sense, Delaware just was not very friendly to building of any time. Plus, it was poor. So I guess in the difference in comparison to other states, that's part of it. And part of my theme here tonight was to be able to look at these kind of details of style and so on and appreciate them and see the style in them, but in the context of the larger state.
All right, yet another question here, David. This one's pretty specific. Was the triple Gothic you showed on the Dover Green built as a Gothic, or do you know if it was renovated from a Federal or Georgian? That Gothic on the Green, I think, had the porch you talked about.
The triple one, the triple,
Yeah, they said the triple Gothic on the Dover Green.
that's the only one I showed on the green. No, I think it was built that way because, but it really illustrates that Delawareans kept with their basic form of the classical square form, symmetrical form, and then adapted other styles to it. And the big issue here that drives style too is floor plan. The center hall floor plan with the flanking doors, and the building is built around it. So Delawareans continued to build that floor plan. So no, I don't think that was, I think that was designed that way. Because the elements of it, like the windows and the batten board and so on, are original. But I'm sure that's been studied and it's on the National Register, so somebody may have already looked at that. But that's my impression.
I have a question here. Are there any good sources for farmhouse architecture in northern Delaware? So many have been lost, more than urban buildings.
Well, the best, and I meant to show it, and wait a minute, I may have it here. One of the best books on Delaware's vernacular architecture and farmhouse doctrine is, can you show me?
Yeah, we can see you.
Oh, all right. Is Everyday Architecture of the Mid-Atlantic by Bernie Herman, or by Gabrielle Lanier and Bernie Herman, which is this book. If it's like very expensive in hardback now, but it's really cheap and used in paperback. And this is kind of a basic source. They have a good chapter in styles, and it's vernacular, and it's very oriented toward agricultural buildings. And the other one is good, and I meant to put them in the presentation, is Barksdale's Maynard's Buildings of Delaware, which was really very good. He puts more emphasis on the kind of history of the buildings in terms of the families and who built them and so on, and less on the specific architecture, but it's really a very good book. And it is also available in paperback, and it's part of the Buildings of the United States, sponsored by the Society of Architectural Historians.
And I'd like to throw on there, David, if I can, that Chad is an amazing repository. It's not a book, but Chad has documented a huge amount of historic farmhouses throughout Delaware, but especially in the northern part of the state that have been lost. And so we're particularly excited that we're digitizing those collections. So those drawings, those photographs, many done by David Ames, will be available to the public on those databases very shortly as we continue to upload more and more of those. And the other thing that's kind of interesting is Becky Shepard and Kate Morrissey did a study of the stone houses of northern Delaware several years ago. And they were surprised at how many farmhouses really actually still survived. And once you drive into subdivisions and drive around a little bit, you find what some people call an island house, a historic farmhouse that survived, but they subdivided everything around it and built so many new houses, you don't even notice them anymore. So Delaware was a very agricultural state with a lot of spread out farmhouses. And a lot of those, a surprising number, do still survive despite the rampant development throughout northern Delaware, but you have to know where to look for them. You have to drive through neighborhoods and find the old one amongst all the 1960s split levels. So, but that being said, there has obviously been a gigantic amount of old farmhouses lost, and I agree with David's everyday architecture is a good start for the basics about those farmhouses. David, someone here asked if you know how the extensive use of Brandywine granite in northern Delaware changed building practices. I don't know much about that, but didn't know if you knew anything about Brandywine granite.
Well, it's part of this. The stone building tradition really comes from Pennsylvania. And so it's used very extensively in mills and so on. I don't know that much detail, but it's limited to northern Delaware, the availability, and it's tied to the southeastern Pennsylvania.
We got another question here, David, and I think I know we're over a couple minutes, but people are asking some good questions. How did the grand buildings of the wealthy DuPonts reflect or influence or stand outside of the architectural styles around Delaware?
Excuse me, say that again?
How did the grand buildings of the wealthy DuPonts, so the DuPont estates, how did they reflect or influence architectural styles around the state?
Well, you're a lot better at that than I could. The kind of interesting things about the grand buildings of the wealthy Delaware, Northern Delaware, is they're secrets because they're hidden on properties and you can't get to them and they won't let you see them. So that it's,
Yeah, I agree.
I don't know anything about them, it's like, so Chateau country is kind of like a, used to be, and it still is for the wealthy, a closed landscape. So it's the buildings of the wealthy of the Delaware is a great secret.
Yeah, and just to chime in on that, so obviously those grand estates were anomalies, but they did take part in a kind of movement in the early 20th century, kind of early suburban architecture and revival architecture, of what some people call the period styles. They channel a lot of colonial revival architecture, Tudor revival architecture, even kind of French chateau-esque kind of style architecture. And if you drive around, especially neighborhoods like Wawasset Park, the Highlands, Westover Hills, you'll see in northern Wilmington much smaller houses, and even houses in the city that reflect that kind of same country house aesthetic, where they were trying to like reconnect with nature and use a lot of romantic style. So I think even though those estates are total anomalies for the most part, it does seem like they builders of more humble or middling houses did try to emulate some of that aesthetic, but overall they were a pretty isolated thing. Someone asked what the second book was that was mentioned by David. I think it was Barksdale Maynard's Buildings of Delaware. Yeah.
Also, one thing we might do, you might consider doing, is putting out a little bibliography, because there's a couple of other Bernie's books, on rural, but there were like 3 times more books on architecture in Louisville, for crying out loud, than there are of Delaware. So it's part of the thing about Delaware's modest architectural heritage is it doesn't attract much attention from scholars. So
Someone else said, are you aware of any similar work being done to catalog 20th century architecture, specifically mid-century modern and post-World War II developments, which I can handle that question. So we're definitely behind in Delaware as far as surveying and studying and nominating 20th century architecture, especially when you get into the mid-century modern stuff. And even more so when you get into post-World War II developments, which often feature architecture that a lot of people don't see as historic or feel intuitively as historic. When you start looking at suburban neighborhoods with what most people consider kind of run-of-the-mill, developer-driven architecture. But the tide is definitely turning. The State Preservation Office definitely wants to continue to promote the survey and recognition of those. At the Center for Historic Architecture and Design, we have nominated several buildings in the last couple of years that are mid-century buildings of various sorts, some mid-century modern, some commercial mid-century buildings, and even things like Independence Mall up on Route 202, the mall that was built to look like Independence Hall, and several other colonial Philadelphia buildings. Chad is working to nominate that to the National Register now, but we are behind in catching up on the historic 20th century stuff. And as David pointed out, anything before 1971, and before you know it, 1972 is now going to be considered possibly eligible because it's 50 years old. And so we need to bring a new lens to a lot of that newer architecture. And I'll also throw Preservation Delaware has talked about doing another lecture or event where we cover 20th century architectural history in Delaware and beyond. So keep on the lookout for a possible follow-up event building on David's excellent talk tonight to highlight some of the newer architectural stuff as well.
Yeah, as you know, my area of specialization is actually suburbanization. And I published one of the first contexts on suburbanization in the 1990s in Delaware. And I have online a National Register bulletin, which you can, on historic residential suburbs, which you can get online and take a look at if people are interested in that.
Yeah. And someone asked specifically about the Frank Lloyd Wright house on Shipley. And yeah, there are, I think, at least 3 or 4 mid-century modern houses in Delaware on the National Register. I wrote the nomination for one of those in the Rockland area. But there's still way more that could be not just nominated to the National Register, even just documented and recorded through survey work. So we've got a lot of work to do there. It looks like I think I've covered all the questions that came in on the Q&A feature. So thank you everyone for your excellent questions. I did want to, someone did say, can the books be sent in the summary email with the recording, please? We'll definitely post links, especially this presentation. The recording of David's lecture will be on our YouTube channel. And we do plan on adding some content to that YouTube posting. So check out the video on YouTube here in the next couple of days, and we'll post as much as possible as far as the books that were mentioned tonight. I wanted to end with one last poll, if you would all indulge me here. As Preservation Delaware prepares to plan future events later this year and into early next year, we would like to know which topics might be of interest to the viewers who are here tonight. So if you could select out of the ones on the screen. So like I mentioned, Delaware's architecture from 1900 to today. A workshop on writing National Register nominations for anyone who might have interest in trying to pick that up as a hobby or to do it for their own property. A presentation about preservation trades and traditional building skills, where we might even feature people who do some traditional trades. Basics about Section 106, which for those that don't know is essentially part of the Preservation Act that triggers review of federal impacts with their undertakings on historic resources. And so anyone who might have an interest in learning the basics of how that works, because it is really important to historic preservation work in the United States and Delaware. Or other, if you have any ideas you want to type into the chat box, we'd love to take a look at those and consider those for future programs, because we definitely want to do programs that are generated by viewers and members of PDI and other people that tune in. So please do share in the box. Looks like we're getting a lot of mid-century modern stuff. So it seems like that would be a good one to feature. It looks like a few responses are still coming in, but I'll go ahead and end the poll now and share that. And so it looks like 77% would like to hear about Delaware's architecture in the 20th century. The next was preservation trades and traditional building skills, which I might also help people understand how to work on historic houses or buildings and how to do that appropriately. The next, writing National Register of Historic Places and how that works, which is certainly something I think we could do. And then we'll check the chat for other ones. So thank you so much for sharing your input on that. That will help us plan events in the future. So with that, we're almost 8 o'clock. I'm sure some people want to tune into the Olympics and watch that coverage, however that works nowadays. I can't seem to find anything I want to watch when it comes to the Olympics. But we want to thanks everyone for tuning in tonight. We had a great crowd. I want to thank David for taking a lot of time to put this together for us and revisiting Delaware's architecture. I'm always reminded when I watch one of David's talks about things I haven't seen or learned about Delaware's architecture myself even. So this has been fantastic. So like I said, please do check out the Preservation Delaware website. Keep your eyes peeled for the annual conference, which is coming up in October, and we'll feature quite a few free events and panels. And also check out this video and other Preservation Delaware videos on YouTube. Have a good night, everyone. And thanks again, David.
Good.